George Bush. The deficit went from $5 trillion to $10 trillion. We introduced the largest entitlement program, and I'm not talking about just what the Democrats did. This was passed by the Republicans. Not all Republicans, but the majority of the Republicans went along with the Democrats in these. We passed Medicare prescription drug plan. Largest entitlement plan since LBJ. Well, I thought Republicans weren't for new entitlement programs. We thought even the old entitlement programs were too big. We passed the biggest one we've ever passed. Medicare was already set to go bankrupt. This has just sped up the bankruptcy, the projections for when Medicare won't have enough money. So we passed the largest entitlement program. What about education? In 1980, when Reagan ran, he says, let's get rid of the Department of Education. It was brand new. It was brought out in the late 70s. He said education should be locally controlled. It's sort of a general belief of Republicans for the most part that we think education, the closer it is to home, the better. Your local school board is better than a board in Washington. But what happens during the Bush administration, during Republican control of the House and the Senate? We get No Child Left Behind. No Child Left Behind was given to us because they want accountability. But you talk to anybody across the spectrum, principals, teachers, old-fashioned fiscal conservatives, everybody hates No Child Left Behind. It goes on top of, we already had CATS testing, it goes on top of California achievement testing, it goes on top of ACT. So kids have tests all throughout, and some of y'all may have gone through some of that, all the different testing that the teachers have to spend so much time teaching. But anyway, so we have during the Bush administration a doubling of the deficit, just entitlement program, and we have spending going through the roof. We did get a few tax cuts, and I told our congressman here when I introduced him last year sometime, I said, you know, y'all get an A+ for cutting taxes, but you get a C- for cutting spending. But they always come back, and he would come back every time and he'd say, well, we have a plan for balancing the budget over 5 years. But they all have that plan, and it's become so ridiculous and far-fetched that you can't believe them. But nobody believes their plans anymore. During the Soviet era, they always had 5-year agricultural plans, and they were always a fiction from the beginning. And they always met their targets too. So they'd have, this year we're going to do this year, this year we're going to produce. And they always met their targets. Of course, there wouldn't be any bread, and they'd all be in line. So they were all lies. In our country, we still give out the truth, but we never meet our targets as far as the deficit. What would it take to meet our targets? We would have to cut spending. It's easy to run for office and say, I'm going to cut taxes, and everybody's for that, and you can get a coalition for that. But everybody's got their hand out. Half the Republicans have their hand out. And I'm going to be overly harsh on Republicans, but that's who we are. We have to self-examine if we're going to get bigger or grow. We also have to get beyond the hypocrisy of the last 8 years, and we have to forge something new, and it's going to take new young people in the party who want to allow the party to get bigger, but it's going to take believability. I was at the Knob Creek machine gun shootout this weekend, and what I told them there is that it's not just the Second Amendment. You can't have the Second Amendment if you don't have the First Amendment. McCain-Feingold was a big piece of legislation that was passed, once again by a prominent Republican, and it makes it illegal for any political group, any citizens group, to buy advertising within 60 days of the election criticizing their congressman. So if a gun rights group wants to criticize their local congressman for voting for gun control, it's illegal. So they've separated this out, and the Supreme Court has ruled, unfortunately, in favor of parts of McCain-Feingold, or maybe they haven't ruled on all of it. Part of it they struck down. But they say that speech is different if it's paid for. Well, a lot of us think that's kind of crazy, that it's okay for the Daily News, they own their newspaper, they can say whatever they want. But if I want to buy an ad and put it in there, they're going to make it not the Daily News. The government will make it illegal for me to put an ad in the newspaper. So McCain-Feingold is a disaster, and that's what I told him at the gun group. You got to believe in the First Amendment if you believe in the Second Amendment. Likewise, we passed in the hysteria after 9/11, we passed the Patriot Act. In the Patriot Act, people were so crazy that we had to do something to stop terrorism, stop terrorists from attacking us, that we gave up our liberties. It has always been in our country a principle since the very beginning. It was one of the things we fought against the British about, was that you should never have invasion of your home by the government without a warrant from a judge. The Patriot Act for the first time allows people to come into your house simply by having a police officer write a note that says that they want to search your house because they suspect certain activities. No one has to approve of this. It's called a national security letter. For the first time, they don't have to announce that they've been in your house. If you were accused of murder, which is horrific, and we think, gosh, even that person accused of murder should have some rights, they knock on your door and say, Mrs. Smith, you're accused of murder, and we have a warrant to search your house. They present a warrant. Under the Patriot Act, they don't have to do that anymore. So it doesn't have to be announced. They can leave listening devices in your house. And for the first time, they can find anything in your house that they believe to be illegal, and it can be used to prosecute you. It used to be in the past that you had to only, it had to be specific to the warrant, basically. So now it's wide open. So I told the gun people, you can't have your guns and feel safe with your guns if you don't believe in the Fourth Amendment, the right to be free from unreasonable search and seizure. With regard to the budget, and with regard to believing in the budget, the other hard thing for Republicans is that we as Republicans need to realize that you can't just cut off the welfare queen and balance the budget. Republicans often think it's just those poor people. If we just get those poor people back to work, we balance the budget. It won't work. About 40% of the budget is military, is all military defense. That's an important question you have to ask. The Grace Commission back in the 80s talked about $500 hammers. They talked about wrenches that cost $150. They talked about the incredible waste in the procurement process. Even Eisenhower back in the 50s said, you know, beware of the military-industrial complex. We need to be fearful of companies that get so big that they could actually be directing policy. When the Iraq War started, Halliburton got $1 billion no-bid contract. Some of the stuff has been so shoddy and so sloppy that our soldiers are over there dying in the shower from electrocution. I mean, it shouldn't be sloppy work, it shouldn't be bad procurement process, but it really shouldn't be baby that these people are so powerful they direct even policy. There's a great YouTube of Dick Cheney in 1995 defending Bush #1, and he goes on for about 5 minutes. He's being interviewed, I think, by the American Enterprise Institute, and he says it would be a disaster, it would be vastly expensive, it would be a civil war, we'd have no exit strategy. He goes on and on for 5 minutes. Dick Cheney said it would be a bad idea, and that's why the first Bush didn't go into Baghdad. Dick Cheney then goes to work for Halliburton, makes hundreds of millions of dollars as their CEO. Next thing you know, he's back in government. It's a good idea to go into Iraq. The day after 9/11, George Tenet's going in the House, and Richard Pearl's coming out of the White House. And George Tenet should know more about intelligence than anybody in the world. And the first thing Richard Pearl says to him on the way out is, we've got it, now we can go into Iraq. And George Tenet, who supposedly knows as much intelligence as anybody in the White House, says, well, don't we need to know that they have some connection to 9/11? He says it doesn't matter. It became an excuse. 9/11 became an excuse for a war that they already wanted in Iraq. But the reason I bring up foreign policy is that you can't balance your budget by cutting off the welfare claim. You do need to reform welfare, you need to reform entitlements, but the only coalition you're ever going to get, and the only way you ever get close to balancing a budget, is if you look at the entire budget, and that means looking at military procurements as well, which means looking at your foreign policy. You have to decide if we have an expansionist foreign policy that believes that we have to have 750 military bases and troops in 130 countries, or whether our foreign policy should be a little more directed towards what the Founding Fathers talked about, and that is more defense of our country and a less offensive or offensive type of foreign policy. Now there's great disagreement. There probably is in this room with me on this. But what I'm telling you is that if you want to be consistently someone who believes in a balanced budget or be a fiscal conservative, you can't just say we're going to cut entitlements. Because one, there's not enough money to balance the budget that way, and two, it's not believable, and three, you're going to have a coalition. You're going to have to somehow get some Democrats to cut waste also, and the way you'll get them on board is to say we're going to cut waste across the board. I think these are important questions, and I think we need to analyze them as a party, and I think to go forward as a party and grow, we will not get bigger if we do the same old message. And so that's what I feel like my job is for the next 6 months or a year is I'm going to be going around Kentucky and giving speeches like this and trying to promote change and growth in our party. Thank you for inviting me.